Hey folks, Tim Newman coming at you from Lite Studios with another Adobe Photoshop CC quick tip. Today we are going to talk about file types in Photoshop. Now this may seem ironic as a quick tip because quite frankly it's a subject that could go on for quite a long time with a lot of different inputs and variables to be considered. But what we want to do is just do a highlight of what we think are the four major file types that are in Photoshop, why you might want to use them, and to at least give you a starting point where you can launch off and do some more research on this subject. Let's take a look. So here we are in Photoshop, and fortunately enough, we have a document opened that we had from our last quick tip video on the rotate view tool. I'll post a link below in the description for that. I think that was a pretty cool little quick tip and a lot of helpful stuff in there for you. At any rate, this document is open for us in the tabbed document interface, and here's our tab right here for that interface. And this tab up here, as always, contains a ton of helpful information that you would be wise to digest when you are looking up here at these tabs. First of all, I'm pretty sure this document hasn't been saved before, and the reason I'm sure of that is because of the name that's right here. This document is currently called Untitled-1. Now, I don't know about you, but Untitled-1 is probably not the name I would give the file when I saved it. So this is clearly something that Photoshop constructed when it created a new blank document for us. So don't be surprised when you see those. Those are documents that you have created but have not yet saved out to the filing system. Okay, it is being displayed at 44.2%. Now you might think that that's 44.2% of the overall document size. However, it is not. It is displaying 44.2% of the available pixels in the image. That's an important distinction, and we have another video, which I will include a link for below in the description, that talks about determining and calculating print size. Be a good idea to take a look at that and understand what that percentage is. Over here in the parentheses, there's some more information that's extremely beneficial to have up here. First of all, Frisket. What's that? Turns out that's the active layer for this document. And whatever active layer you're on, if you have it named, Photoshop displays that up here in the tabbed interface. That's one of the really great reasons to use naming in the layers panel in Photoshop, because this keeps you dialed into this is exactly the active layer in this document right now. Okay, RGB stands for red, green, blue. It's also telling us that that's the current color mode of this document. It is a red, green, blue document, and we can confirm that by looking over here in the channels panel and see that in fact there is a red, green, and a blue channel in addition to that RGB composite channel that's created for us in real time on the fly to give us a view of the image that makes sense to us visually. A couple of other channels down here, we're not going to pay a whole lot of attention to these other than to note that they are here, and these channels that are down here in addition to the color mode channels that are here are known as alpha channels. So real quickly we can say, wow, this document does have some alpha channels. We can discuss in other videos what these alpha channels mean, but it's important to know that they're here, especially when we're thinking about getting ready to save this document. Okay, back over to the Layers Control panel, back over to the tab. Right here, 16, that stands for bit depth. This document has a bit depth of 16 bits per channel. That means 16 bits for red, 16 bits for green, and 16 bits for blue. We won't belabor the binary math here, but I can tell you that 16 bits means that we have 234 potential unique colors that we can have in this document. Now, that is not to be confused with color space. Color space is a discussion about ranges of colors that are supported by output devices. Bit depth is a discussion on capacity in terms of the number of unique individual colors that a document is capable of maintaining. All right, last but not least, this asterisk is telling me that I have changes to this document that have not been written out to a file yet. Now, considering that this document is titled Untitled-1, doesn't surprise me to see an asterisk here because I don't think it's been saved at all yet. However, if the document did have a name indicating that it had been saved at one point, and I see this asterisk here outside this parentheses, that tells me that from the time I opened this document to now I have made edits that have yet to be committed out to disk. Important distinction, and certainly something that we're happy to see here in the tab because it keeps us dialed in on what we do and do not need to save in our workflow. Now it's time to get to what we came here for in the first place, and that is Photoshop file types. And the easiest way to see a list of file types here is to go ahead and save this document. So we're going to come up here and we are going to execute the file save command. That is a Command S for you Mac users, a Control S for you Windows users. And as soon as we do that, because this document's never been saved before, we actually get the File Save As dialog box. Now Photoshop is smart about this. It knows that this file has never been saved before, so it gives us this Save As dialog box the first time around. In subsequent saves for this document, once it's been given a name and it's out there in the filing system, Photoshop will just directly save the file as the format that it was currently opened in and not present you with this dialog box. So that makes the workflow a little bit quicker once you have determined a file type and a name. Okay, now there are all sorts of pieces of information to be considered here in this dialog box. Things like the name of the file, the extension of the file, the location the file is going to go to in terms of your favorites, directories that you may want it to go in, etc. But for right now, we're going to forego all of that and really just talk about the 4 major file types that probably interest us the most in Photoshop. Now, the one thing I will say before moving off of this dialog box and into these formats here is don't change or mess around with this extension here. It's not the end of the world if you do, but what you do is you break what is known as file associations in your operating system. And I encourage you, if you have questions about that at this point, to take a look at file associations for your operating system in Google, and you'll get a whole host of information that will obviously be helpful and insightful for you. I think we'll probably do a video on that in the near future, but just something I want to point out for now. Don't mess up this extension here and that period that exists here in the file name. Those are critical. Okay, so file types right here listed as formats. And we have a little combo drop-down box right here. And here are the file types that we are going to concern ourselves with. Photoshop documents are default here for a new document, and in an associated way, large document formats. Now, large document formats are still Photoshop documents, but they are to support document sizes that are bigger than 2 gigabytes in size. Things like panoramas and focus stacking, stuff like that, you'll find that they tend to get large, and sometimes you'll need this large document format. If you try to save a file that's larger than 2 gigabytes, Photoshop's going to come back with a message and say, hey, you need to save this as the large document format. And that's where you'll find this. You also notice the extension changes when you go from a regular Photoshop file to a large document format Photoshop file. It goes from that PSD file that we saw here to the PSB file that we see here. Other than that, the options here are one and the same. Next file type that we are interested in down here in order of capacity or capability is the TIFF file. This stands for the tagged image file format. And you might see this as an extension here as a .tiff or a .tif. Both are the same. And Photoshop files and TIFF files share a lot of similarities. The primary difference being that Photoshop files, or those PSD files that we saw to start off with, offer really a higher level of compatibility with other Adobe applications or applications that have been engineered in such a way that they are capable of understanding the layers and the layer settings within a Photoshop document. You'll find, for example, in Adobe Premiere, if you have a Photoshop document with a lot of layers in it, you can bring those layers into that Premiere document and use them individually, which is really, really cool. And it also respects transparency layers, something we'll get to in a little bit. Okay. Next, in terms of order of preference, is the JPEG file, which you'll normally see as a .jpg. If you spend any time around the web, posting pictures to Facebook, putting things on your website, or emailing images to other folks, you've probably used the JPEG file, or at the very least, seen it. The JPEG file is a compressed file. It does tend to discard a little bit of data from the picture, but because it's a compressed file and it does that discarding of data, it ends up being a much smaller, more compact file. Obviously, emails better and downloads quicker on the internet. So that's the advantage of JPEG files. There are some potential downsides too, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then last but not least, we have what a lot of people refer to as the PNG file or the PNG file, and that stands for Portable Network Graphic. It's very similar to the JPEG file, but its primary difference between it and the JPEG file is it supports a thing known as image transparency or transparency layers. Okay, let's jump back up here to the Photoshop file format real quickly. All right, in the Photoshop file format, there are some things here that matter to us and some things here that are nice to know about, but the really three most important things here are whether or not we're saving alpha channels, whether or not we're saving layers, and whether or not we are embedding the color profile with the picture. Now, as you remember, when we looked over at the channel strip a little bit ago, there were alpha channels in there, those two extra channels at the bottom that looked like, and in fact really did, contain masks. We have to ask ourselves, do we want to keep those alpha channels? If you're done with the document, you don't think you're going to do any more editing, then maybe you don't want them. But if you think you're going to do more work later, or you have selections that you need to yet refine and reapply, then you will probably want to keep those alpha channels. If you have that check mark turned on, next time you come into this document, those alpha channels will still be there in that channels panel at the bottom. The other thing that we want to be concerned with here is layers. Now, if you remember looking over here in the layers control panel, this document does have a bunch of layers. We may or may not want to save those layers. If we think we're going to come in later and we're going to edit some of these components in this document separately from one another, i.e. change the frisket separately from the image or retype the test and retype the test and regenerate the mask for the frisket, then we probably want to keep those layers. If we're all done with that and we're confident that we're not going to do any additional editing, then maybe we throw those layers away. It's a decision that you need to think through carefully because it has an impact on what you'll be able to do with this file in the future. Not to mention the fact that if we were to collapse all the layers that are in this document right now, we have made permanent edits to the image itself because now the word glamour is no longer a separate layer that we can turn on or off or change. It is now part of the pixel structure of a single layer. The upside to getting rid of alpha channels and layers is the file becomes smaller, but keep that decision in mind. Now, ironically, this document is in the sRGB color space, not a color space I would typically use for a Photoshop file, but for this exercise it was just fine. And we can decide whether or not we want to include that color profile with this file as we pass it on down the road. Typically your answer there is yes, but in video there are times that you may not want to include the color profile. But that's a topic for another discussion. Okay, large document formats are going to have the exact same options, and in fact if we go down here to TIFF files, we're going to see the exact same options again. So TIFF files and PSD files are kind of like cousins. They work really almost in exactly the same way. The primary difference is TIFF files tend to be a little more compact and load up a little bit faster. Now I find that difference to be negligible, but it still is there. Now, what you want to consider in whether or not you're saving a file as a PSD file or as a TIFF file is one of two things. A, am I going to be using this in another application that respects the layer structure and the information that is stored in those PSD files, and do I need access to that information? If the answer is yes, if you're going to Premiere or Illustrator or something like that, then you probably want a PSD file. If the answer is that doesn't matter to you, then the TIFF file is probably your better choice. Ultimately, B comes down to you're considering printing this file. And if I'm considering printing this file, then I'm definitely want to send it off to my printer or to my print service if I'm outsourcing it as a TIFF file. I don't want to send it to them as a PSD. That's extra work for them, and typically they don't want to deal with that. And I certainly don't want to send it off as a JPEG because inevitably the print quality of the JPEG is not as good as the TIFF. So print options are typically TIFF files. And what's really great about this is you don't always have to make this decision here in Photoshop. If you have Lightroom as a part of your workflow, then you can, in the export routine, clarify whether or not you want it to be a PSD, TIFF, or JPEG at export time. So every time I'm getting ready to export something out of Lightroom to print, I am exporting that as a TIFF file. All the other options here are essentially the same. So let's move on to the JPEG file, number 3 in our list of file types that we like. Now you notice the JPEG file does not support alpha channels and does not support layers. So what you are going to get out of the JPEG file is a single layer file. Obviously smaller, more compact, easier to transmit around and download on the internet and send to others as email attachments, but you are making the choice when you save this as a JPEG file to flatten this image, discard any ability to edit these layers separately. So that's something to keep in mind with the JPEG file. It has its place, and there are certainly lots of times that I export files as JPEG files, but I'm very, very careful not to discard my original PSD or TIFF file if I plan on coming back to it later. I think of the JPEG file as more of an export file type than a working file type. Now that's not always true, but by and large, I'll stick with that rule in the back of my head, and you likely should too. Last but not least, the PNG or portable network graphic file. A lot like the JPEG file, it is essentially a single layer file, meaning that you are again flattening the image and discarding layers and alpha channels that may exist there, turning this into what is essentially a single layer destructive edit. Here's where PNG files are really, really handy. It's where you create images that have transparency in the background. If I happen to have the word glamour and no picture behind it, and I have that layer 0 turned on that you see over here to the right, then I have a file that has the word glamour and a bunch of transparency around it. Maybe I'd like to layer that over the top of another file. Maybe this is the basis for a file that I create as my watermark, something to think about there. Or, last but not least, maybe I'm going to be using this in a video over the top of another video channel, and I want that transparency so the video shows through. Basically, the ping file, or the ping file format as it were, is all about leaving the ability for things to show through in layers below. So there you have it. I'm going to come up here and select PSD file again, and I'm going to call this rotate view. Just to make sure I can find it later, I'm going to stick it on the desktop, and I'm going to save it. Now, this dialog box comes up all the time, and normally I would turn it off, but it's about maximizing compatibility, and it allows it to have PSD files be opened easier by other applications within the Adobe suite of products or by Photoshop itself in different versions. Talk about that later in a different video, but more often than not, I will turn this dialog box off with this don't show again checkbox, but being that I teach with this computer, I like it to be on so students see that coming up. You'll notice as soon as I do that, going back up here to the tab, my name for my file has changed here to the actual file name. I see the extension so I know what file type it is, and that indicates to me that it's no longer a new or unsaved document. And last but not least, our asterisk is gone, indicating that we do not have any edits that have not been committed to disk yet. All right, couple comments to wrap up. See you on the other side. So there you have it, what we consider to be the 4 most important file types in Photoshop, and a little bit of information about what each one brings to the picture. See what I did there again? All right, no, being seriously, I would not stop my study of Photoshop file types there. I would continue to dig into and understand all of the different file types and formats that Photoshop is capable of both reading and writing. The more you know about this, the more interaction that you can have with all sorts of different formats out there that exist in the world. And that's what makes Photoshop really, really powerful, is that ability to work with almost an endless number of different graphic file types. Well, we hope you've appreciated this video. As always, we encourage you to look for that subscribe button down there and mash that guy. Make sure you get updates on what videos Softlight Studio is bringing to you next. Thanks again for tuning in, and remember, as we always say, learning equals skills, practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there.